deciding cases based on activism or self-restraint, and using the speech conduct continuum. Now that we have a sense of how justices can use some of their toolbox, we need to know where they look in the toolbox for the different pieces that can get them where they want to go. We need to say something about their jurisprudential approach to deciding cases. Justices, when they come to the court, the tradition is that what you do is you follow precedents. You use stare decisis. And your job, it is said, is to supplement the cases that have been issued in the past. Your job is to defer to earlier courts. Well, that hasn't been done for a very long time. And so there is a long and helpful debate for the foundation of understanding where the court is going in the First Amendment area, the Bill of Rights, in everything they do, to remind ourselves what is the difference between activism and self-restraint. One of the most activist courts that we have seen in our history was in the early 1930s, when the so-called 9 old men under Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes repeatedly voted against Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the overwhelmingly Democratic-led Congress and Senate as they were trying to pass general welfare assistance and general regulations by the federal government to deal with the Depression. But the majority of the justices who had been appointed by the 3 previous Republican administrations believed that these decisions in dealing with the Depression should be left to the state governments, should be left to the states, not to the overarching national government. And it was that continual disagreement by the majority of the Supreme Court that led Franklin Roosevelt to propose in 1937 the so-called Court Packing Act. I would like the power to add to the court 1 justice for every justice over the age of 70, up to a limit of 15 justices. What he was trying to do was not reorganize the court, as the title of the law suggested. He wanted to change the direction of the court's decision-making. He wanted to make it more New Deal-oriented, more pro-Roosevelt. He wanted the power of the national government to regulate the economy. He wanted to be able to set prices and wages and reorganize different businesses. He wanted to be able to create assistance programs, work programs. He wanted to stop the ravaging of the Depression. But the conservatives on the Supreme Court were saying no. Well, when he proposed this court packing fight, it did get the attention of Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes and the majority of the Supreme Court. What Roosevelt did not know when he proposed this radical reconstruction of the membership of the court was that one of its members, Willis Vandevanter, had already privately told the Chief Justice, "I'm leaving." And in a 5-4 court, it was going to change the direction of the court anyway. The law was not passed. Roosevelt did not win. But when he started to add new members to the Supreme Court as older members left, he changed the direction of the court just by his appointment process. By 1938, it was crystal clear in a series of cases that the Supreme Court was going to defer to Congress and allow them in the economic realm to do whatever they wanted. The Supreme Court was getting out of the business of saying no to Roosevelt and to Congress. And they made this very clear in a case called Caroline Products. United States versus Caroline Products in 1938 dealt with the question of spilled milk. It was a question of how much filler you can put in milk to reduce the content of the milk and thus increase the profit that you will make from that dairy product. And there was a big debate about what percentage of the filler you can put in and who would actually make that decision. Should it be the national government? Should it be the state government? Should it be Congress? The Supreme Court said, we will defer to whatever Congress says. We are no longer worried about being activists, reaching out and deciding cases and making precedents and overturning precedents. We are no longer in the business of running the economy. But as they wrote that opinion, it was written by Harlan Fiske Stone. His law clerk, a man named Louis Lusky, went to the justice and said, I think we should tell people what kind of decisions we are going to make in the future. We should tell them we're out of the business of economic regulation, but maybe there are other kinds of cases that we can get into that business and we can decide those cases. Here's where we can be activists next. And what Lusky proposed to Justice Stone is we need to do something to protect the voting rights. We need to do something to protect the ability of people to go to the polls and amass a majority and vote out of office certain legislators and take control of the legislature and change policy. If we can say we will protect the voting enterprise, we will make sure that democracy works properly. And he said, what can we do about ethnic, religious, and racial minorities? They will never have enough votes to accomplish achieving a majority in the legislature. Maybe we can add a paragraph that says we will protect ethnic and racial and religious minorities. Well, Stone liked the idea. Let's put in a footnote, a billboard. This is what we're going to do next. So they circulated this memo. And a memo came back from the Chief Justice, Charles Evans Hughes, and he said, this is a great idea. I think what we also should do is we should say any case that deals with the Bill of Rights or the 14th Amendment, that's how we get the Bill of Rights to the states. Any case that deals with the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment will also be protected by us. Bring us those cases too. What they were doing was creating what was then called a double standard. They were saying, while we will be self-restrained in economic legislation, while we will be deferential, while we will say, what would a reasonable person think this law means? While we are upholding economic legislation, in the areas of the Bill of Rights, the 14th Amendment, the voting protections, and protection of minorities, we will have a higher level of scrutiny. What they called in this paragraph, there were 3 paragraphs in footnote 4 of the Caroline Products case, what they called more exacting judicial scrutiny or more searching judicial inquiry. It's the same thing. We're going to look at these rights more closely. The burden of proof will be on the government, not on the person suing, and we will be more inclined to protect these rights. I am describing to you the first development of the levels of scrutiny. Bring us economic legislation, you're probably going to win if you're from the government. Bring us individual rights issues, probably if you are an individual, you will have a much better chance. So in 1938, the court is saying, for these kinds of issues, we're going to look at them more closely. This is the dawn of the civil rights era. My civil rights field, my civil liberties field really starts with Caroline products and goes forward. And one of the first set of cases that the court debated the meaning of this two-level theory of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, they involved the Jehovah's Witnesses religious group in the 1940s. Now, to understand these cases, you have to understand that by now, Franklin Roosevelt has changed every seat on the Supreme Court. No, not quite yet. No, it is. Every seat on the Supreme Court. When Charles Evans Hughes retired, he promoted Harlan Fiske Stone, a Republican. He promoted him to the Chief Justiceship. And then every other member of that court in 1937 left. And he filled every one of those seats, seeking to put New Deal originalists, a New Deal Roosevelt advocates on the court. He succeeded sometimes, he didn't succeed other times. So we have a much more liberal court, maybe one of the most liberal courts ever, certainly one of the most liberal courts until we saw the Warren Court in the 1960s. And this liberal court is being asked to decide a series of cases of a small religious group that is evangelistic, likes to proselytize, and what they do is they go to people's towns and they go to people's doors at their residences, and they try to talk to them about their religion. And one of the things that they were doing in the 1940s is they would knock on people's doors, people would open the doors, and they would talk to them about their religion, and then they would try to sell them for a small amount of money their religious publication called The Watchtower. Towns and cities didn't want this group in their town proselytizing. Well, they couldn't pass a law that would say you can't proselytize for a religion. You can't evangelize for a religion, but they could pass a law that said you can't be a solicitor going to a person's home and knocking on the door. You can't charge money for the Watchtower. And the Jehovah's Witnesses said, well, if you keep us from doing this, and if more cities and towns keep us from doing this, the result is going to be that we will not survive. We can't support our missionaries going out to the different towns unless we get this money. You're going to put us out of the business of proselytizing, which the towns were very happy to possibly do. It's a perfect case to come to the Supreme Court. So I'm going to start with the first case, Minersville School District versus Gobitis. This was in 1941. It was a Pennsylvania law that said all elementary school children during World War II must stand up, put their hand over their heart, and salute the flag, something that I did when I was in school. They must swear allegiance to the United States. The Jehovah's Witnesses believe that that is worshiping a false icon, that you can be eternally damned for that. And so they were teaching their students, you should not be standing up, saluting the flag. Well, what will we do? And they said, what you do is you just stand up and you do nothing. You don't put your hand over your heart. You don't say anything. Public school. Well, people didn't like that. It was a lack of discipline, and they wanted uniformity and conformity. And so these school children in the Minersville School District in Pennsylvania were suspended. And it became a court case. And this was one of the first tests of the new New Deal Roosevelt court as to whether or not they were going to use footnote 4 of Caroline Products footnote. Would they say that we will protect these school children who are a discrete and insular minority, so that's paragraph 3 of footnote 4, and they're also coming to us under the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. It may not surprise you, so short after Pearl Harbor, that this court was not interested at all in overturning this law. 8 members of the court said it is perfectly acceptable for the school board and the school to compel, in the interests of discipline, in the interests of patriotism, in the interests of increasing the knowledge of citizenship as an American citizen, it is perfectly acceptable to compel people to salute the flag. We are not holding for the Jehovah's Witnesses' First Amendment free exercise of religion right. We are holding for the state. One justice on the court, Harlan Fiske Stone, who signed the Caroline Products case and the Caroline Products footnote, said, "What are you doing? You are forcing little children to salute the flag. You don't even know what their views are. You cannot compel them to salute the flag. It is against their religion." The writer of the opinion was Felix Frankfurter, and he was very concerned about public impression of what he did. He was very concerned about being a good friend and ally of the person who put him on the court, Franklin Roosevelt, and he knew Eleanor Roosevelt. And he was quite unhappy when Eleanor Roosevelt made it very clear that she agreed with the minority. She agreed with the idea that they should be able to do whatever they want to do, but not be forced to salute the flag. And over time, the general wisdom of the United States moved toward Harlan Fiske Stone and Eleanor Roosevelt's point of view. That's case one. Here's case two. Murdoch versus Pennsylvania. So in Murdoch versus Pennsylvania, the Jehovah's Witnesses are going to the town of Murdoch, in Pennsylvania town, and they are trying to proselytize at people's homes and sell their Watchtower magazine to those homes. The Supreme Court looked at this case, and now suddenly a majority of them are following the Caroline Products footnote. And a majority are saying, you can't deny these people their religious views. William O. Douglas is given the opinion to write. His father was an itinerant minister in the backwoods of Minnesota. And when he saw this case, he immediately thought of his father. And he writes in his opinion, there is no difference between what these Jehovah's Witnesses are doing on people's porches, talking to people in their houses, and what ministers are doing in their churches. And when they collect money for their Watchtower, it's like they're passing the collection plate. So for this town to say they cannot do that, it's the same as though they went to a regular church and said to the minister or the rabbi or the priest, you can't do what you're doing. He argued that the First Amendment was an absolute protection. He said freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press are in a preferred position. I will protect them always. I don't care what the regulation is. Douglas was an activist here. Douglas was an absolutist. And he was arguing and would continue to argue through the 1940s, as would the majority of this court through the 1940s. We will absolutely protect. Congress may make no law abridging the freedom of speech or negating the free exercise of religion. Well, in dissent, Robert Jackson was very different. Robert Jackson said, no, you didn't look at the facts properly. Look at what these folks are doing. He described how these people would end up on property owners' porches. They would block the property owner from going back in their house. They would keep the door open. They would say things to the property owners that they did not want to hear. And he made it very clear that he had very little respect for the Jehovah's Witnesses and thought of them, his term was, as pests. He was redescribing the facts. And what he was doing was saying, I am a self-restrained jurist. I will protect the right of the town to protect the property rights and to protect the privacy of the owner. He was placing the right of free speech and right of free exercise of religion against the owner's property rights and privacy rights. Jackson and Douglas did not like each other, and they were battling with each other over these issues. But it led people to think, oh, Jackson is right where he's always been. He's anti-Jehovah's Witnesses. Imagine how surprised they were in 1943 when another Jehovah's Witness children in public school flag salute case came to the Supreme Court. West Virginia versus Barnett. And it was very simple. It was the same case as Minersville School District, but it was in West Virginia. Can you compel school children, Jehovah's Witnesses' faith, to salute the flag? And just 2 years before, the vote had been 8-1 that the state could do what it was doing. What we didn't know at the time, but learned later on in Felix Frankfurter's diaries, which were published, we didn't know that 3 of the liberal justices, William O. Douglas, Hugo Black, and Frank Murphy, had changed their mind. They realized they'd made a mistake. And Douglas, who didn't like Frankfurter either, there were a lot of animosities on that court. They were known as 9 scorpions in a bottle. That's what one of the academics called him. He went to Frankfurter with a big smile and he said, I just want you to know that the first chance we get, we're going to overturn your Minersville School District opinion. And Frankfurter said, why? And Douglas said, Hugo has changed his mind, Hugo Black. And Frankfurter said, oh, has Hugo reread the Constitution? And Douglas smiled and said, no, Hugo has read the newspapers. They knew that the public wanted the court to support those little children and to support the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so when this case came to the Supreme Court, the majority was always there. Now, the question is, how can Jackson change his view about the case from what he wrote in Murdoch versus Pennsylvania? He'd shown how little respect he had for the Jehovah's Witnesses. How is he going to support these children in refusing to salute the flag? Well, he had an ingenious solution. His solution was to say, remember IRL, PRAC? The right that we're talking about here is not religion. The right that we're talking about here is not speech. The right that we're talking about here is, in fact, symbolic speech or freedom of thought. The key to this case, he said, is that these children did nothing to disturb the discipline of the school. They stood there silently, not saluting the flag and not reciting the oath of allegiance. And because they did this, the Bill of Rights absolutely protects their right to think and behave as they wish. For the government to tell them what they had to do was compelled speech. It was coercive. And he said, this is not possible. He has some of the most activist language we've ever seen. Some samples. The very purpose of a Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and to establish them as legal principles to be applied by the courts. He added, those who begin coercive elimination of dissent soon find themselves exterminating dissenters. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. And then finally, the classic quotation from this freedom of thought, total absolute protection of a religious group's case. If there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us. The vast majority of this court is totally protective of this religious group. Well, that's the example of activism. And that's the example of how you can change the right and thus change the issue. And why looking at the level of scrutiny is so important to figure out not only how the justices are deciding, but how you can change that decision or argue yourself. But I don't want to leave this without saying something about Felix Frankfurter. Now he's in dissent. He's the self-restraint justice. He's consistent. I'm going to stay with the precedent of just 2 years ago. And you're basically telling me you've changed your mind not because we've changed the membership of the court, because you've changed your opinion. This will diminish the public support for us as a judicial institution. We look like politicians now. We're simply changing our mind because that is where the public is. And so Frankfurter argued for self-restraint. He argued for reasonableness, a lower level of scrutiny. He argued for the fact that what we need to do is let the legislature do what is necessary to promote patriotism and citizenship during World War II. It's a fight for our survival, and this is what the government wants to do. As far as I'm concerned, we can have the government acting like a national school board. Now he needs to explain why this is not an indication that he does not support the Caroline Products footnote. It's not an indication that he does not support individual rights and freedom of religion. And so he went to his clerk. They waited very late to write this opinion. It's the old days where they had manual typewriters. His clerk once told me when the justice showed up the night before, he reached into his pocket and pulled out scraps of paper. He had been assembling scraps of paper of ideas he was going to use to write this opinion. So he sat this clerk at the typewriter and said, just type what I read. And from one of the scraps of paper, he read this: one who belongs to the most vilified and persecuted minority in history is not likely to be insensible to the freedoms guaranteed by our Constitution. Were my purely personal attitude relevant, I should wholeheartedly associate myself with the general libertarian views in the court's opinion, representing as they do the thought and actions of a lifetime. But as judges, we are neither Jew nor Gentile, neither Catholic nor agnostic. We owe equal attachment to the Constitution and are equally bound by our judicial obligations, whether we derive our citizenship from the earliest or the latest immigrants to these shores. As a member of this court, I am not justified in writing my private notions of policy into the Constitution, no matter how deeply I may cherish them or how mischievous I may deem their disregard. As a matter of the court, he said, I must defer to the elected legislator because I am here appointed life tenured, and their interpretation of the Constitution of what is best during World War II is what I am going to follow. So we are looking at a court that is now battling in the issue of Jehovah's Witnesses just how involved they should be in promoting the civil rights of those Jehovah's Witnesses. And in our next section, we will see just how willing they are to do that.